Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this week wound up both being busy and kind of contentious. I had a lot to say, once again, but I do hope some folks take to heart the messages that I'm looking to get across in these reviews, which might encompass more layers and people than you might think. Got all that? Alright, good. Let's get on the pulse. So we've got 9 albums on the docket, but let's first go back a bit and talk about, from Rannoch, Reflections Upon Darkness. So this has been on my schedule for a while. It's been a bit of an effort to get the lyrics here properly, and I'll admit that once again, that death metal, even on the progressive side, doesn't usually tend to be my thing. But I also checked out Rannoch's 2013 debut and found it pretty solid. The guitar work was really impressive, the more guttural passages balanced out pretty well, and while it did run long and still wasn't really my thing, I did get the appeal. And so, 7 years later, well, okay, 5 years later, there was an EP in 2015, we got this follow-up, and well, I still hear the appeal. I will say it leans a little more on the acoustic and piano progressive pieces to augment a lot of the atmosphere, and it can feel a little hit and miss in how well the transitions back to the seething riffs or the truly impressive soloing works. But I would argue that Rannoch hits a pretty good balance between wallowing in the raw, brutal filth of death metal and that furious intensity, and the more refined progressive soundcraft, especially with all the arranged touches and the ability to still deliver, well, a lot of that intensity. Again, as somebody who isn't always the biggest death metal fan, I appreciated the melodic complexity of a lot of those passages in juxtaposition. Even if I can also still tell that the Hanged Man, it can sound a bit forced for whatever even passes for crossover in death metal these days. What certainly is not all that accessible is the second half of this project, which follows off some of the vaguely suicidal themes to plumb the darkness with an extended interpolation of Lord Byron's 1816 apocalyptic poem, Darkness, split into 7 parts with more lush arranged swells, symphonic backing vocals to lead into even more pummeling and progressive death metal, with brighter solos and, again, some questionable transitions. And by the end, well, I do find this a pretty potent listen with some truly great bass lines and percussion. I'll also say without truly gripping content or a textured melodic structure that feels a bit more distinct, I just wind up kind of distant from what is a very solid album, likely to please its audience. Ergo, for me, it's a very light 7 out of 10, but I know a lot of death metal fans will appreciate this a fair bit more, so if you're curious, check it out. Next up, from Grim Grieves, Sound Waves. This is the sort of review I don't like making. Not just because it's inaccessible or difficult, it's basically a pretty brief selection of accessible instrumental hip-hop with one song with vocals, but because it sounds kind of bland and mediocre, and that's not something I like to highlight for producers who sound like they're just getting started. But I did get confirmation Grim Grieves is okay with me covering this, so here we go. This sounds like something I could get from your average beat pack or from a YouTube tutorial, and not one that gets a lot of attention. And I say beat pack because a lot of these pieces feel like just the bare minimum to build off of. There's not much in the way of blending melodies or consistent sounding percussion. The drum machines as a whole sound really thin. The melodies we do get are often very bare bones and muted on keys or guitar. And while there's the occasional touch of warmer texture or slightly rougher grooves, without more distinctive samples or even much in the way of tunes, this becomes background music, but not in a way that produces a lot of a vibe. Now, Flying, pretty good example of this. I actually like that lo-fi clatter and the bass touch, but then we get some really glassy clicks near the front and it doesn't match with anything. Similar case how the flutes and the guitar are actually decently balanced on Gently Calling You, and then the trap percussion sounds really seedy and then just dropped on top. A better example might be My Kingdom with the Middle Eastern inspired melody, but I gotta be honest, that sticks out like a sore thumb here and it doesn't match with anything else on the tape. There's not a lot of cohesion. And that's not even counting how canned the vocal production sounds on Yesterday, with some very clumsy multi-tracking not helping a very basic flow. Hell, the most distinctive part of these is the rather nasal audio watermark that isn't just obtrusive and mood-breaking, it's kind of actively obnoxious. And that kind of leads to my biggest problem. If the only element that's artistically distinct will compromise the vibe, it can't be that good. So to me, it's a strong 4 out of 10, and a note of caution to up-and-coming producers and artists, and friends of such, who put their projects on my schedule. Ask what makes your material distinct, and really stand out, and work on refining that rather than sending me an earlier draft. Because I can say it, I can tell the difference. Next up, the self-titled album from Bedroom. Well, this is some post-punk inspired shoegaze / dream pop, obviously cribbing from Jesus and the Mary Chain and Slowdive, alright? Not saying that's a bad thing, I mostly like both those acts, but it's also the sort of project that will coast on familiar texture rather than do anything distinct or interesting, especially in the song structure where we're seriously lacking any sort of hooks or a vocal presence that doesn't sound like a real husky wisp. And that's assuming the songs just don't lose all direction midway through, which happens a little bit too often on the back half of the album. And when the tracks feel as underwritten, basic, and vaguely sour in their emo-leaning pretensions as they do, it becomes rapidly apparent this is a project that's coasting most on momentum and atmosphere. And while the latter rarely falters, the former often does, especially when the rounded underlying grooves start meandering. A real problem when I'd argue that the bass lines and the hazy guitars are the best part of the album. But let's be real here, if you know your dream pop or shoegaze or post-punk, this is kind of mid-tier across the board. It would have been forgotten in the genre's prime 2 or 3 decades ago, and it really doesn't give me much to talk about. Light 5 out of 10. You like the sound, you'll find this passable, but you won't find it memorable. Just saying. Next up from Will Wood, the Normal album.
Alright with you, and when we find out what's wrong with me, could you tell me how I'm right for you?
I'm gonna cover this at length to make a point surrounding a specific aesthetic in music that only works for me in extremely limited cases. The screwball, quasi-dark, vaudeville, highly theatrical, cabaret, or carnival-esque music, where the point is to be as super zany and manic until it tips into outright darkness. I'll be blunt, I get the appeal. I grew up in the mid-2000s, this was an aesthetic that was worked to death in pop rock and emo, but it's so rarely works for me these days because I can count on the number of albums where it clicks for me on one hand, often because it's trying to overcompensate for slapdash writing, going for cheap shock, or really bad production that can't nail the atmosphere, or how it can sound like shtick that's just not as witty or fun as it wants to be. And I specified aesthetic, not genre, because I've seen this more from pop to country to a lot more than I would like in metal, and why when we started listening to Will Wood, he had an uphill battle to win me over, even before I heard the Weird Al Yankovic-esque exaggerated manic delivery in his vocals. And I'll admit that while Self-ish was fine enough and occasionally had some decent lyrical moments, it still had enough of that vibe to test my patience, and thus I did not have high expectations for this. And here's the thing. I get it's an obvious satire. Obvious because deconstructing the repressed chipper plasticity of 50s culture has been done to death since the 70s, and if you're not into this aesthetic and stylism that I described, I'm not sure how much of this will resonate at all. But Will Wood is not just doing that, because I'm not sure layers of detached irony and nihilism can get away with how he throws himself into the trans-medicalist, trans-trender debate on I, Me, Myself, where he himself has described as a critique of problematic proponents co-opting the gender identity movement and spaces for those genuinely very deeply oppressed and abused. But then he ends the song by literally saying all identities are equally invalid, and it seems to me any real point seems missed. And then there's the entire midsection focusing on mental health, where by the end it just seems kind of incoherent. You don't want people to find identity within their mental illness, as you think that some people are shopping around for a diagnosis, but you also don't want them to find normality within pharmaceuticals because you've been taking the piss out of conformity the entire project with lines that come out like the things that make you special are the same things that make you strange before we end on the most basic, well, we're all gonna die anyway, nihilistic sentiments, which kind of flies in the face of all of that subtext about not wanting people to falsely co-opt mental illness or gender identity if you're just gonna blow it all off anyway. And I'm not sure any of this fits well with the very manic performativity of this style, even if you're being subversive about it, which is kind of a shame because when you get to the compositions themselves, this might be Will Wood's most tolerable album, and that he'll occasionally slow down a little bit, use a slightly less exaggerated vocal tone, and provide a bit more balance across the album so it doesn't give me a splitting headache, at least not immediately. Now, granted, that forced Frankie Valli impression he keeps doing, which is followed by a gargling cackle on the opener, and his falsetto on the next two songs, especially when it's paired with touches of ska, and the entire mix has this very forced chintziness and strangely whitewashed lack of groove that's got the mastering of a pretty bad off-Broadway musical. Okay, look, the only songs I found tolerable was the warped lullaby of, well, Better Than the Alternative, which even still has some of the ugliest drum machines and ukulele I've heard in a while, and the piano work and the Spanish guitar on Black Box Warrior Occultra, it's manic, but not exploding immediately. By doing so, it can build a bit of atmosphere until the horns drop in and the spoken word kills any sort of momentum. That's probably my biggest problem with this album beyond all the confused nihilism. There's so much obvious flop sweat in the overwritten lyrics and especially the delivery that I can't appreciate any of the impressive playing or any attempt at atmosphere, and the more I grasp what this was actually doing, yeah, the less I liked it. In other words, I like 4 out of 10 because I know this sound works for some people, I get the appeal, but the content and delivery means I never want to touch this again. Not at all fun. Next up from Big Silky Volumes 1 and 2.
Dirty bitch, I say what I say. It's fuck 12 every day.
Okay, so there's a deceptive amount of context I want to provide before discussing these two short projects, which I'm grouping together more out of convenience and because I can easily touch on my points to critique to both pieces. So, this duo, 2 women. The younger Angel Davanport's from Minneapolis. The older and more well-known Chicago MC is Psalm 1, who actually has a pretty extensive catalog that I went back and explored. And I know this will come across as unduly harsh, but I think I appreciated Psalm 1's influence and place within Chicago hip-hop continuity more than I liked a lot of her sound. She's a really good and expressive rapper, and on average makes pretty interesting content, but I find a lot of her albums kind of inconsistent in both structure and production, and the bars aren't really wowing me in terms of poetry. Now, in recent years, she's embracing more hard-hitting, trap-adjacent beats, which I will say are a good fit for her content, and with this, oh man, I wish I liked this more. If I'm gonna draw a contrast, Angel Davanport is a more methodical and precise MC, while Psalm 1 has bigger personality. Even with her shorter verses and lethargic delivery, it doesn't always translate. And what I can tell, she did a lot of the production here too. And you know what? I'm not gonna deny they have a lot of chemistry, but the trap-leaning beats are often very bare bones. And both projects pick up the Psalm 1 problem of feeling kind of undercooked, especially with the shorter songs on Volume 1. And really, considering how both MCs are pretty straightforward in a lot of their content, you start asking what sets them apart beyond a lot of sexual openness and hard left-wing politics, which come up the most in the second disc and kind of reads like my Twitter timeline for better and for worse. And I find myself wishing there was just a few more layers and a bit more development to amplify what they have. A lot of what I like. Angel makes a Run the Jewels reference on Volume 2, and I can hear it in style, if not intensity or quality, and I'm not sure songs that go smaller without more introspection really win me over. Example, the closer of Volume 1, Rap Chicks is Dead, referring to their last group which apparently fell apart, and even with them coming out on top, it just feels kind of small time and a little bitter to cut it as a closer, not helped by how it gets brought up again alongside Twitter beef on the soft block. Or let me put it like this, if I'm gonna go to underground hip-hop, I'm expecting a level of insight or intensity the mainstream wouldn't otherwise provide. And when someone makes the claim that everyone ain't that woke, which is true, as again, I'm in agreement with the vast majority of the politics expressed by her on this album, I kind of want to hear a follow-through beyond the circumspect reference to current events to which we're getting already, even from the mainstream. Again, this is a duo that's got real potential, and I'll say it, Angel Davenport won me over on intensity and construction alone here, but as it is, I hate to say it, but it's a 6 out of 10. It's just a step shy of getting there. At least for me. Next up, from Cloud Nothings, The Black Hole Understands. Full disclosure, I wanted to cover this last week, but I had a bit of a time getting a hold of the lyrics properly. But while I'm generally a little bit less enthusiastic when Cloud Nothings go for a more breezier power pop or pop punk instead of their heavier, sharper side of indie rock, I figured in a time like this, could be a worthwhile, relaxing listen. And, okay, remember when Cloud Nothings did that project with Waves where the most common description of it was effortless, and you couldn't tell whether or not that was a compliment? Yeah, this kind of falls in that category for me. And even as someone who is tolerant of Cloud Nothings going for a breezier tone, I'll say it again, this is incredibly lightweight and really inessential from them. And no, I'm not asking for another round of Attack on Memory or Last Building Burning, but this is flimsy as all hell. Dylan Baldy's vocals are probably what annoyed me the most here. He sounds either fried or purposefully trying not to sing all that loudly in a vague callback to a certain stripe of late 80s and 90s indie, and that hurts any sense of presence that he might have. But okay, maybe that was the point. The entire album sounds like it's calling back to a softer stripe of indie rock that was prevalent from the late 80s to the mid 90s with some of the guitar and the bass interplay, a little more power pop, and maybe it's not fair to Baldy or drummer Jason Garrix that they're working with a cleaner, more stripped back setup, but there are three issues with that. Number one, the drum mixing is really inconsistent, especially with that filmy cymbals pickup. Number two, even if you're making an indie pastiche, the limited presence in the hooks of these songs, they wouldn't have stood out even at the time. Hell, it's the bedroom issue all over again. But finally, number three, for as nakedly depressed and self-flagellating in relationships as these songs are, it's a really discombobulating listen when you consider how jaunty a lot of the melodies are. More just blissfully accepting of everything going wrong, and only the black hole understands, and even in messy times like this, where just coming to that acceptance might help your mind and sanity, it does not resonate for me whatsoever. But at the end of the day, I'll be honest, it's more forgettable than bad, and I won't even call it that. It's more niche to a very certain demographic that likes a very specific stripe of indie rock, and songs like A Weird Interaction, A Silent Reaction, and Memory of Regret, they do hit a very specific, awkward, college rock understatement that works fine enough. So, strong 5 out of 10, I can see this maybe finding an audience. Just not me. Next up, from Margo Price, That's How Rumors Get Started.
Letting me down.
I don't know why I haven't talked much about Margo Price, until I remember I've got contentious opinions about Margo Price and her albums in alternative country, and then it snaps into focus. I mean, you'd think her material would be an easy sell for me. She's apparently incredible live, she's a singer-songwriter in Nashville who will take political risks in her content, especially on her second album. She seems to have good taste in rock and country, originally signed to Jack White's label, and yet it just does not translate on her albums. And for once, it's actually pretty easy to point out why. The booming, bass-heavy, but kind of washed-out mixes just don't flatter her thinner vocal timbre, which creates the bizarre feeling of a live recording where she's struggling to center herself that just does not reflect in how she sounds live. In fact, I would argue her vocal mixing as a whole consistently has been a mess. And then when you follow up and dig into the writing, look, I'm just not all that impressed, especially in comparison with a lot of her peers, and especially for the political stuff. The power, the precision, it's just not there. It hasn't matched her hype machine for a while now, and when certain critics have fallen head over heels for her material, look, there are way more in indie country that could deserve the overwrought coverage. I've given a lot of it in the past couple of months. In any case, it's now 3 years later from her last album, a label change, a recording trip in LA for this new project, and, well, at first, given that I knew that Sturgill Simpson co-produced this project, I was a bit surprised at what we got with some piano-accented and serviceable 80s-inspired classic rock and country, and then the bricked-out guitars slid in by the third song, and I'm not surprised anymore. But it's not like the main problems have gone away. If you thought Margo Price sounded thin and unsupported on her first two projects, it's sadly even worse here, when she tries to muster up some soulful, sultry presence in a classic rock style, and she just does not have the fullness of timbre or mix placement to pull it off. She's not someone like Alice Wallace who can pull off that timbre, especially with this mixing. She probably need production closer to Lindy Ortega or Karen Jonas, but it's not like dabbling with a rock edge gives her material any sense of firepower either. That's the odd thing about this mix. You can tell that Sturgill Simpson wanted to amp things up, but he didn't want to compromise that bad vocal mix, so any guitars that could really explode feel kind of muffled, and we wind up with a lot of the same rote, colorless tones that she's always had. And I'll be blunt, the content's not saving this album because, again, it just feels thin, especially all the back and forth relationship cuts that run together and could well stand as a metaphor for the country music industry. Hell, I'd argue Stone Me is most thuddingly on the nose with that. But there's a righteous fury you can pick up from the best anti-Nashville songs, and the feeling here doesn't get there. It's more sour grapes, which is kind of a shame because I actually kind of liked the emotional nuance in examining why someone goes back to bad relationships time and time again. But unfortunately, there's just still not much that's unique to this writing, and it's not a good sign when her most descriptively clever song, Twinkle Twinkle, it's your standard calling out of Hollywood phoniness song. I mean, I didn't like it when Will Toledo did it this year, and he landed more punches than Margo Price did. Oh, look. I was lukewarm on Margo Price before, and now 3 projects in with no signs of change and existing issues that are only seeming to get worse, I can't recommend it. It's a 5 out of 10, just for the fans at this point. Just saying. Next up from My Morning Jacket, The Waterfall II.
Get back, water.
Oh, this looked like this week where I just crap all over the critical darlings of the indie set. Although, here's a question. Was My Morning Jacket ever considered a great band so much as an influential one? Because there is a difference. Yes, I hear a lot of their creative DNA and so much reverb-soaked, country-adjacent folk and rock with a hint of vintage psychedelia that spilled over the 2010s. But I'm not going to claim a ton of it has been interesting or has aged well after the sound has been so thoroughly overexposed. Maybe more of it works in the jam band or festival environments, but I never found the songwriting particularly good. The hooks and sound can be very haphazard, and especially in their early years, all those critically acclaimed projects all ran way too long. And what's all the more frustrating is that when they try to get more spare and groovy in the second half of the 2000s, I was even less impressed. Most because frontman Jim James's falsetto can get really grating for me, and the mixes could get really weedy and sour in oddly unappealing and inconsistent ways. But hey, in 2015 they made a slight return to the earnest swells of reverb-heavy indie rock on The Waterfall, and 5 years later, we got the sequel album. I mean, I'm not even kidding. All these songs were reportedly from those old recording sessions years ago and only repackaged here, the intended but long overdue sequel, and of course, it sounds exactly like you think it does. I technically could end the review right here and say, it sounds like more of The Waterfall, but a little slower and stiffer in the 70s AM country singer-songwriter affection for way too much falsetto. I mean, for God's sakes, they opened the album with a song called Spinning My Wheels, and if that's not a blatant warning sign, I don't know what is. Now, granted, it's also part of the point. The song Wasted here seems like it's calling out nearly every song that came before it, which thematically circle around not getting the hint, backsliding into wishes for the past, a discomfort with the present situations that are all going wrong. But when you get a snapshot of home, everything becomes better again. It's no place like home. But you still have to get through those songs that, if I'm being charitable, they're often warm, they're well mixed, the back half of the album is actually really pleasant, but I gotta be honest, it feels even more derivative now between mid-70s AM rock schmaltz, willowy indie seeking to emulate that's kind of short on the groove, and all the squonking layers of burbling synth and the occasional jagged spiky guitar that not only match with nothing, but they're also tried and true indicators of that sort of discomfort. But I can say all that, and no My Morning Jacket fan will care. They've been doing this for over 20 years. They're now very much back in all that comfort zone. And while I hear the influence, I just wish the vibe was more consistent for me. 6 out of 10, but it's not a jump on point. Pretty much just for the fans at this point. And finally, from Brett Eldredge, Sunday Drive.
It feels like love's coming my way, and the sun ain't even shining.
You know, I've heard a surprising amount of buzz for this project, and not because of any big single, but because Brett Eldredge seemed like he was ditching mainstream Nashville for a change for something a fair bit more interesting. Even recruiting some producers who worked with Casey Musgraves on Golden Hour, and penning the vast majority of the compositions himself. Now, this was actually kind of exciting for me. Brett Eldredge can be a really unique and potent writer when he wants to be, and given how I've got a fondness for some of his more wild pivots, I was curious how this might turn out, and my god, I did not expect this at all. Let's not mince words here. This is Brett Eldredge's best album to date, with a title track that will be in contention for the best songs of 2020, and probably the most complete example of a perennially underrated Nashville country artist able to finally cut loose and deliver something so strikingly great and unique since, hell, probably Randy Houser's Magnolia. But it's not blind to Americana, or indeed anything like Casey Musgrave's psychedelic side. Fall for Me is probably the closest example to her sound, so much as it's a borderline throwback country soul album in the vein of what Ray Charles put out in his country years. Which makes sense when you remember how much Brett Eldredge has idolized crooners of a much older generation, but has a much distincter, more craggy vocal tone than you think he would not imitate them that well, but it does add a lot of unique flavor, and from there he builds on his strengths effectively. The guitars and pianos are warm and rich, the arranged elements and horns, they're there, but very tasteful, the grooves are refined, and there's a mature, good-natured heft to Brett Eldredge's delivery and writing that's just so damn remarkably charming. I rarely say that an artist's soul-searching pays dividends in their art, but with Brett Eldredge, the leap forward he made, you kinda can tell it did. Now, that's not saying this is perfect or a transcendent project. I can tell a lot of folks are going to call this a bit too mid-tempo or adult contemporary, and I do wish there were more songs that had the impact of the title track in the writing. There are absolutely some standouts, like the hopeful optimism of Good Day, the reflective side of Crowd My Mind and Gabrielle, or just the storytelling of the bouncy Magnolia, or especially Then You Do, often backed up by some splashy acoustics or mandolin, or just a really great hook. It highlights how when Brett Eldredge gets specific and adds that little bit of flair for detail, he can strike gold pretty consistently too. And indeed, if he had brought a bit more of that detail to the most direct soul songs here, this could have been among some of the best country music of 2020. But as it is, it's still absolutely great. It's worth a lot more attention than it'll likely get. Very strong 8 out of 10. Huge recommendation. This is something special. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I want to end on a bit of a high note, and this album really is fantastic. It's going to be underrated by so many people. But yeah, I probably said something contentious here. Please, again, it's all my opinion. You all know that. I'm just pretty forceful about it. And if you've got contentious points, comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel, or maybe adding albums to my schedule, link to my Patreon is right over there. Again, feel no obligation to do so. It's tough times for everybody. I absolutely get it. But hey, if you want to, the option is right there. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.